Kyle, for those people who did not go to Johnson Central, do you want to let them know who this individual is down here in the corner?
I'm afraid to say now.
You're afraid to say that. That's the one and only Abraham Lincoln. For those of you that missed that, like, entire 18 years of your education, to learn who that was. It's pretty important. So anyway, why Abraham Lincoln? When I think about affective disorders, Abraham Lincoln always comes to mind. Right? Isn't that true? That's true for some people. Sierra's giving us this like weird look back there.
I've never heard that. Why are you saying this?
He was depressed as hell.
Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know that.
Didn't he have some type of condition because he was so tall?
Gangly.
Yeah.
He was gangly. That's a condition. He was gangly.
It's a specifier, okay?
Really
It's
tall.
quite possible he had some hormonal abnormalities or something. It's not surprising. Maybe he had some pituitary gland tumor. I don't know. Right, you see that. To alter your hormones.
No, he was depressed.
Wasn't his wife a bitch though?
I think she had some other mental health problems. Not in the depression direction.
Because he didn't want to go to the theater, right? And she's like, no, let's go, and then he got shot.
I don't know.
That's what I learned in history.
Was that at Johnson Central?
No.
Well, then it's suspect. Apparently this is a major revelation to some of you. But Abraham Lincoln is probably one of the most famous depressed people of all time.
I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true.
I really think this is true. There have been multiple books written, right, Destiny, solely about
I'm not buying it.
his depression.
Google it.
I'm gonna Google the most depressed person.
Famous person.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's Abraham Lincoln, the most famous depressed person. You have to phrase it that way or Google.
What about Robin Williams? He was pretty.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, but
He's not as famous as Lincoln.
Historical figure. How about that? People don't care about those. They only care about the others.
I'm pretty sure it's Abraham Lincoln.
I'll let you know when I get there.
Lincoln and depression. Slow. Sounds like a good.
You know what? It's been a long day. It says Kristen Bell, '1.
Who? I don't even know who that
Well,
is.
that bitch.
No, actually, it was number 30.
The girl on Frozen.
Yeah. You know.
She's a girl from Twilight. No.
No,
Kristen
that's
Stewart.
Kristen Stewart.
I don't think he's on this list.
All right. Well, while the rest of you are figuring out who Abraham Lincoln is, some of us will talk about some of these other things. We do want to talk about sort of different affective and mood disorders. We'll talk a little bit about depression and bipolar disorder today. Give you some sort of interesting, maybe neurobiological, neurochemical ideas about what's going on, and then think about why we might treat them in certain ways. And then at the end of this, you'll realize we really don't know what we're doing. We're just pumping people full of chemicals and stuff happens. Which is really, so spoiler alert, Jason, if you've turned to the end of the chapter, I think the last sentence is, it sort of works. Because and then what I think is really interesting about this is, and you'll see this as we go through, it's sort of a recurring theme. Well, we're going to give somebody something that's going to increase their serotonin levels, but, well, then it sort of decreases their serotonin levels, and, well, then later it increases their serotonin levels, and, well, maybe they felt better sometime in between there, but we're not sure if that was really related to serotonin level, right? I mean, and it's just kind of this, like, continuous recurring thing where it's like, well, we give someone something, but then there's some compensatory mechanism, and maybe that's what's doing it, but we don't know. And because mechanistic studies are so we have, you guys have that big book. What's that thing called?
DSM?
Yeah, the DSM, right? And that thing tells you how to know if a person has depression, right, Megan? So you can open that thing up to page like 2. I don't know where it is. Page 2, and it says, if you're depressed, you exhibit these, like, 8 of these 10, or 6 of these 7, or 4 of these 12. I don't know, right? Whatever it is. It's some number of symptoms, right? I don't really know. And you're like, okay, that person's depressed. Okay, we've got that. For bipolar disorder, there's a similar set of categories, right? There's a similar set of symptoms. And that's probably on page 6. I don't know. It's a couple pages over. And you turn around and you're like, okay, so these are the symptoms for somebody who's got bipolar disorder. Where, Olivia, in that book, does it tell you how to tell if a rat has depression?
Probably in the appendix.
Yeah, it's not in there, right? Right, that's the problem. And so the problem is we can try to study these disorders in humans, but they're all going to be sort of inferential studies, right? We're not going to be able to really like crack open somebody's head while they're depressed and go, hey, I really want to see what's going on in there. Let me just pluck out your brain and see what's happening. Now we can do post-mortem studies. I don't know if you guys are planning on keeping your brains when you're in the ground, but if you're not, give them to somebody who can do something with them, right? And if you happen to have a neurological disorder, all the better. I mean, for those, scientific purposes, right? Maybe not for you, while you're trying to live. And then you kind of take a look at this. Now we've seen, post-mortem tissue, right? Folks have looked at post-mortem tissue. We'll talk about some of that evidence later. For folks who have depression, we're like, oh, okay, so there's some differences there. But again, it's one of these like, well, chicken or egg things, right? Is that what caused your depression, or did your depression cause that? So you really have no idea. So then your next best bet is to try to make a rat depressed. I mean, Corey, I don't know, right? I mean, we can definitely like think about what we look at is we look at these sort of behaviors that a depressed person exhibits, and can we get an animal to exhibit those behaviors, right? Similarly with like bipolar disorder, right? I mean, how can we make mood swings in a rat, right? How can we have to make it depressed one day, and then the next day we've got to make it manic? I mean, how do we do that, Destiny?
Drugs.
Drugs, yeah, drugs. So we do a lot of drug studies. Now the problem with that is, okay, so there are some issues where this might be true, but let's say you're in the clinic and you've got a client come in and that client says, whoa, whatever the 5 things are they have to say, and you go, okay, you've got bipolar disorder. I don't know what those 5 things are. So they'll say those 5 things and you go, okay, you have bipolar disorder. Well, that's great, I guess, right? But is that because we gave that guy drugs? No, I mean, he just has bipolar disorder, right? I mean, so there's some other sort of, I'm going to say organic, there's some other organic thing going on in their brains or in their bodies elsewhere that's giving them, depression or bipolar disorder. And when we're inducing those behaviors in a rat, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're mimicking the mechanisms, right? Just because I can make a rat run around and, redecorate its house, doesn't mean that I've given it bipolar disorder, right? It just means I kept this rat up for 3 or 4 days, and then right before it goes to sleep, it has some 30-minute period of crazy activity, which is how one way that they do mimic bipolar disorder in rats is sleep deprivation. So they'll keep these rats up for an extended period of time, and then they go, okay, rat, you can go to sleep. But instead of the rat just going down, and I don't know, this probably happens to you guys. Have you ever stayed up so long that you kind of, right, Jason, you get to that point where you're kind of like, oh man, what now? I know I gotta go to sleep, but it's not happening, right? And so the rats do the same thing. And for about 30 minutes, they'll run around and, wiggle up against the walls or whatever it is rats do, I don't know. And then they just kind of pump. They're down for 30 minutes, or they're down for for how long they're going to sleep after that time. So is that really bipolar disorder? Well, no. Does that tell us about drugs that can maybe treat some of the behaviors of bipolar disorder? Well, perhaps, but that's really going to be the best of it. And we only have 30 minutes there. So you have to be ready with your drug blow dart or something to try to hit this rat while it's in this manic phase for 30 minutes after you've kept it awake for 2 or 3 days. So that's a real problem, right? And so I hate to really be down too much on treatment of these disorders as much as I will, because we're really kind of shooting blind at a lot of this stuff. But we're sort of limited on things, right? And it's even worse when you start moving into trying to treat other disorders that are maybe more complicated than depression, right? I mean, we know a lot more about that sort of neurobiologically than we do other things. So, just kind of interesting. Anyway, that just sort of frames up sort of the discussion today, right? As we talk about these things, keep in mind those sort of caveats to these different lines of evidence, right? Now, what you can do, Montana, is try to put together multiple lines of evidence, right? So if we have sort of this drug-induced model, we have some other sort of organic model that we're working on. We see that in humans it kind of works this way, and then we can kind of put 3 or 4 lines of evidence together and maybe come up with a decent explanation of what's going on. That's sort of the best that we have. So there you go. For those of you that don't know, let's kind of make sure we have an idea about what is major depression versus bipolar disorder. You guys have a handle on that, right? For our purposes, I don't think you need to know the DSM criteria. You just kind of need to know if you're depressed, you're stuck in a funk for an extended period of time. If you're bipolar disorder situation, you get down to those funks, and then sometimes you just, you just jump right out of like a jack in the box and just take off. You should put that in the DSM, right? Jump out of there and just, you like start doing crazy things, right? Like, whoa, I don't know.
Bipolar 1 actually only requires a manic episode. It doesn't
Yeah.
require a depressive episode.
It does not, you're absolutely right. And bipolar disorder often, for our purposes, we're really just thinking about the mania. We can figure out how the depression works otherwise, right? So that'd be something, right? I mean, that's like, they should call that like rectified bipolar disorder because everything's going positive, right? That's what I would have named it, but they didn't ask me. I also would have put in there jack in the box like behavior. I'm gonna slip that in. Some of these people like Dr. Kennedy, she needs to know that because I think that would really help, right? You see why I had no inclination for clinical work. Hey, how many of you have ever been depressed? You don't have to raise your hands. I mean, all of you have been, right? I mean, if you haven't been, Kyle, you're a sociopath. Which odds are somebody in this room is, maybe even a couple people. So that could happen.
We're in grad school, so
Yeah. I
In the
guess.
trough.
all the time.
What?
The trough.
The trough. You're in the trough. You'll get out of there eventually. But you have little moments, right? What?
You don't remember him saying we were in the trough?
In the trough, you're in the bottom, right? You're kind of like, we got third year's the worst year, right? Because you're like, you've been in it so long, you're like, I see no end of this torture. But then eventually you're going to start slowly coming out. So there's a thing called reactive depression. This happens when something bad happens. You just like, oh, I feel horrible about that. Pretty normal. It's not really like mental illness, right, at that point, unless it becomes some sort of problem. It lasts for a long time. You're like, oh man, I lost my favorite socks, and you start crying about it. Then that's probably like pathological. Sock crying, put that in the list. That's a behavior. So there we go, right? Not a big deal. Anhedonia, that's a word, right? You guys know anhedonia. That's something that's actually we're going to think about so maybe later. It's kind of interesting. Why folks who are depressed experience anhedonia. All right, suicide, folks think about suicide sometimes too. Depressed individuals obviously commit suicide at a much higher rate than non-depressed individuals. I can tell you anything you need to know there, or don't already know. Here are your symptoms for depression and bipolar disorder. Again, not too big of a deal. We talked about the overlap between depression and anxiety. In particular, there's some overlap with alcohol dependence in these issues, right? So that can really be problematic. We talked about that comorbidity. I think what's really interesting about this is, maybe you have heard of that guy Hippocrates.
Hypocrites?
Oh, yeah, hypocrites.
Those are different. Hippocrates, yeah. Somebody's doing some zoo shipping. I don't know why Olivia thought that was so funny.
Yeah.
What?
We're in the trough.
You're in the trough.
Go crazy.
Just thinking about a giant crate with a hippopotamus. That will not be on the exam. But this guy was around, he was around what, in that BCE time, which was a long time ago.
What's the E?
It's before Common Era, BCE, or CE Common Era. That's the.
It's the same thing.
Before Christ.
Just because
I've always just written
I don't think that's what the abbreviation is, but
That's what I was told in school too.
Yeah, me too.
Before
think-
Christ.
the
Yeah.
E was
That's
not
what
on.
we were on. That's literally what I was
The E's
taught.
not been on there that long necessarily.
Oh, okay.
And then it was also like eight, just to give you guys like a lesson, it was like AD,
And BC,
Domini,
that's-
yeah.
Yeah. After
Yeah.
death.
Yeah, that's actually.
And that's literally what I thought it was
It's actually
until this
well, yeah,
morning.
Anno, it's year domination, Lord.
Well, they
No,
were.
I realize that.
Johnson Central let me down.
30 years we've been
I know, it's
accounted
not
for.
Yeah, I know, right? There's like this weird gap there, right?
Yeah, I just thought that they
Time
just
stopped.
didn't count those years.
Are other people not
Think it's right.
That's, y'all weren't taught that?
No, I was
Not
definitely
that.
taught BCAD, like in
I don't even
Jesus
know who
terms.
Christ is.
Yeah. Whatever.
I don't know.
It's not gonna drastically.
I know, it just
change.
kind of drastically blew my mind a little
Yeah,
bit.
don't worry about it.
Drastically.
But what was interesting is that like even Hippocrates was like, hey, you know, I noticed these depressed people and they're all so anxious, and I noticed they're always like carrying around a cask of wine. That's kind of weird. So even Hippocrates was like, yeah, these things go together, right? You know, it's kind of these comorbidity issues, which is kind of interesting. So there you go. Obviously, comorbidity predicts more severe symptoms. You guys don't need to know this. I mean, or not from this class. You know it from some other class, right? So that's important. Depression lasts a long time. You kind of have these relapses, right? I know, it's like a really great outlook, right? Like somebody comes into you and you're like, oh man, I'm depressed. Like, well, how long you been depressed? Like 2 months. Well, geez, you got 4 to 7 to go. Just hang in there. Or I can give you a drug that might start working in 6 weeks. You know, I mean that's.
Keep seeing me.
What?
They keep seeing me in about 4 months. I'll cure you.
Yeah, keep coming back. By some of that snake oil. That was a good one I slipped in there, Destiny, that no one got. Just to put it out. All right, not a big deal. Slightly higher risk for women than men to be depressed, or at least tell you they're depressed. Might be something important. Hey, average age of onset is like 27, right? I mean, that's something. How many of you are past 27?
Ooh,
Hey,
there.
yeah, I remember, right? You're like, hey, maybe I made it. You know the other thing that you have to, like,
27. You are 27. You're not past 27. You're there.
when was your
I said I'm
birthday?
there. October.
Yeah, her birthday, she's past it. I mean, not
We
much,
got plenty
like,
of time.
like 3 weeks, but. But the other thing, Jason, like, when I turned 30, I also had this big revelation, like, you know what? I'm not gonna be schizophrenic. And I was like, that was a real milestone, right? I was like, I made it to 30, no problems.
Except for that 40s.
What? I'm sorry?
It can happen when you're 40.
It can, but the risk is just.
Or subsequently in women.
It is, right? Men don't really have that late kind of peak. Women have, it's weird, right? For women and schizophrenia, I didn't mean to talk about this today, but it's kind of weird. There's like that, there's obviously like, you know, like that, like kind of like late teen, early 20s sort of business, right? But then in women, you do have that like weird 40s little blip out there. So
Can't wait.
there's one more person in my household I gotta wait on. We get a few years on that and we'll be good. Smooth sailing. So there you go.
Till it's time to die.
You get to mention.
Yeah,
What?
I said till it's like time to die.
I'm not gonna die until I'm 96. That's what the Wharton School of Business told me.
What?
What?
I did a life expectancy calculator.
Because those are accurate.
I'm gonna trust this one. Gave me a number I like. It's like 96 isn't bad. And then I got like, you know, some extra chance to make it to like 102 or maybe 94, 92 is the other.
Right. The business school.
The business school's the perfect place to go for your life expectancy calculators. Do you know
Not like
why?
med school.
Why?
Retirement planning, investments, wills. You got an old guy that's a CEO and you got to get him out. When's he gonna die? School of Business.
And then just kill him.
Yeah, then they just tell you, oh, you're not going to die till you're 96. Invest all your money. Hurry. You gotta make some before then.
Just taking my time, letting my investments accrue a little bit. I don't want to pay too much in taxes up front, Jason. Just wait. Wait until I start dumping more money into my retirement fund. You guys don't even think about retirement funds, do you?
Yes.
Some of you do? That's great. That's impressive.
My dad wanted me to open one when I was 13.
Yeah, that would have been nice.
I have a retirement
Because you could have
fund.
retired when you were 12.
Of course.
That's how retirement works.
Started when I was 16.
Because my parents are accountants, so it's just.
Oh, that's a
I'm
different
not-
I went
story.
to public school, okay?
Hey, here's an interesting thing, right? Like, folks are getting depressed at younger ages. And I don't know, there's like some statistic here, like you look at this and it's pretty crazy, right? Like in 1905, now I don't know how accurate statistics are from 1905 on how depressed people are, but really, like nobody gets depressed in 1905 at all. And it's just like this guy who's like 75 and he's like, man, I wish I was dead, but I'm not, and that's why I'm depressed. But now it's like, whoa, look at this. I mean, it's just like a massive, like there's a ton of people depressed now when they're like 15. I mean, and 25, it's just crazy, right? Who knows? You think that's true or not?
I think not.
Really?
When was Trump born?
I don't know.
That's when it started?
1905. He is like, what, the second or third oldest president
That
ever?
makes sense.
Dumbest?
Right behind Ronald Reagan,
Mm-hmm.
who had Alzheimer's when he was elected. True story.
Explains a lot of things.
It does, doesn't it?
But he looked good on a horse.
That's why I'll never be a president.
You don't look good on a horse.
Too short to look good on a horse. I might look decent on a donkey, but that just doesn't have the same sort of
Jesus.
regal, presidential sort of look, right?
Taller than
That's what I told my wife. My wife wants a horse. I'm like, no, I'm getting a mule. She's like, why a mule? It's like a horse will do whatever I tell it to, and it will get me into trouble. But a mule will just stand there, even if I tell it to do something
A
stupid.
horse will get you into trouble?
Yeah, I mean, you tell horses to go, and they just go. That's what horses are supposed to do.
Yeah.
But a mule, you tell it to go, and it'll think about it.
If you run as a Democrat, you might be able to make the donkey work.
That
Oh.
would be like a nice, like bumper sticker, right?
I'd buy one.
I would buy it.
Well, that's like 3 votes. So maybe people are getting more depressed, I don't know, at younger ages. I mean, there are some reasons that maybe people are getting more depressed, right? I mean, if you think about your life in 1905, I mean, what were you going to do? Well, I mean, you're probably going to do whatever your mom or dad did, right? You didn't really have a whole lot of choices. And you probably didn't really have to think about that too much. You just got up and did your business, went to bed, I don't know. Who knows? Lots of stuff going on right now. There we go. We talked about mania, not a big deal. Hey, when you're in one of those manic phases, often you'll do things that you shouldn't do, right? You'll make poor decisions. So try to avoid those.
I had a picture to buy a house.
Bought a house?
Really?
Organic state.
I won by 32 pounds of jelly beans that I didn't like jelly beans.
32 pounds of jelly. You know they sold it.
Probably on Amazon.
That's a hippo crate full of jelly beans.
Oh,
What a jelly beans. 32 pounds.
Came back around.
Wow. Yeah,
Were
I
they
know.
like
those-
variety flavor or?
I didn't ask.
The wrong details.
That's what I could have thought about though, right? Was it like all licorice?
Was it all buttered popcorn? Because then you're like, oh,
I don't know.
got a
You
good
just,
cherry
you're
cherry,
not
not
super
super
hot. You just followed it up with I don't even like chili beans. On to the next.
Perfect.
Wasn't the only thing they're spending money on.
Okay. I thought you were gonna say like 32 pounds of heroin or something.
Yeah, me too.
Jelly beans.
But jelly beans, that's rather innocuous.
Cute.
He's not cute.
Well.
He's annoying.
So how do we know about like genetic contributions for affective disorders? That's kind of interesting. Lots of adoption studies, twin studies, right? What's kind of interesting about this is like monozygotic twins, these are identical twins. They've actually got a pretty, it's like 50-60% or more concordance rate for some of these affective disorders, right? So if you've got an identical twin and they develop depression or they develop bipolar disorder, I mean, you've got a pretty high percentage you're going to as well, right? This is like sort of considerable genetic component to that. However, it's not 100%, right? So it's not a guarantee just because even if you have an identical twin that has the same DNA as you, that you're going to experience the exact same sort of mental health issues. Even though you might share a very, very similar environment, your environment's going to be slightly different, you're going to have different life events that happen to you, and so you're going to have slightly different sort of outcomes there. By the time you get out to like dizygotic twins, which are fraternal twins, which really share about the same amount of DNA as like any sort of sibling, right, full sibling group, really the concordance rate's down to like 20%, right? So it's a much smaller, still significant contribution, right? But it's not as high. So there you go. Watch out for your genetics. And here you can just kind of see, now some of these are quite high. Like if you think about like bipolar disorder, for example, that's like an 80% concordance rate, right? I mean, so that tells you what you can get from this is you can say, well, that's got a much higher genetic contribution than something else. I mean, if you go down here to depression and you're like, 35% or something, right? For monozygotic twins. So that's got a smaller genetic contribution. That's still significant, that you would have that. But some of these other disorders are, there's some difference there. I don't know. I think that's kind of fascinating, right? They do these linkage studies, so they just look for DNA fragments in places, which is kind of interesting. Not a big deal. We've already talked about environmental stress. It can definitely cause problems, especially early on, while you're still developing, your nervous system. If you're exposed to a bunch of stress hormones that are at different patterns and different levels, that can really affect your developmental process there. Sets you up for problems later as an adult, right? I guess you guys have probably heard, adverse childhood experiences are some of the biggest predictors of sort of any problem as an adult, right? So, everybody needs to grow up in cotton candy land or whatever, and then we would all be like perfect adults, right? All of us went to Johnson Central. Just be perfect. See how well adjusted Kyle is. I don't know. Just think about how bright that shirt is.
Imagine playing across the net for a minute.
That's intimidating. Yeah. Was it a night game? Because you wouldn't even need to use the lights.
That was the day. We won.
You won?
We won.
We?
It was doubles.
Oh, it was doubles? Oh, who's your partner?
Megan.
Doesn't matter.
It's not like you'd know it.
You never know. So, anyway, there you go. Watch those hormone levels. And, even if two people experience the same events, they often respond to them differently, right? I mean, how many of you have been through, you guys are all going through something right now, right? That third-year trough. And some of you are responding better to that than others, I can tell, right? When I see some of you in the hall and you've got like that one eye that kind of just does that. And then some of the rest of you just, like nothing's going on. So, you're better at worse at that. It just happens. Don't worry about it. What's really interesting is when you start looking at folks with depression, and you start looking at their cortisol levels. We talked a little about cortisol last week, right? We talked a little bit about cortisol again this week. You actually see like a really elevated cortisol level in folks who have depression, sort of this continued elevation in cortisol levels for these folks. And that's because if you kind of go back a couple steps, right? And you start going back to their ACTH and then back from there, what we call CRF, right? Corticotropin releasing factor. And this guy comes out of the hypothalamus. And in fact, we're going to talk for a little bit about the hypothalamus and the role that the hypothalamus has in some of these disorders. I don't think people think about these things a lot, but the hypothalamus plays a major role in affective disorders. How many of you, we'll think about two things here that might kind of clue you in, Cassie, that the hypothalamus is important. Have you ever heard of like seasonal affective disorder, right? Mm-hmm. Right? I don't know if that's a real thing or not. It's probably in the DSM. So what do they do to treat you for that? They just like jump out from behind a bush with a bright light and shine it, right? I really think that's like phototherapy, right? That's true, right? So you also, if you move to the state of Alaska, that's what they give you, a lamp, right? It's part of your tax breaks for living there. Once you get so far up, you guys know on the planet, or so far down, right? Like the days start getting screwy, and they really have like longer, like kind of dark periods sometimes, and you have to adjust for that, right? You guys need sunlight. Okay, this is like a good take care of yourself, get out once in a while and see that there is still an outside, even though again you're in that third-year trough, right? So you guys need to get out and do things. So yeah, just take a look. It's really sunny out there, right? It's bright and gloomy right now. So You need that sunlight to do a ton of things. But we'll go back and have like a little like visual system lesson here, right? There's a great connection between some of your ganglion cells in your retina and their the photosensitive ganglion cells. They shouldn't be photosensitive because they're not actually telling you like, hey, I'm looking at a bird. Instead, they're connected directly to something called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, SCN if you want to abbreviate that. I have trouble spelling suprachiasmatic. It just means above the optic chiasm, right? And so there are some of those axons that jump off the optic nerve there, go into the hypothalamus and tell the hypothalamus, hey, idiot, it's daylight, time for you to get up, right? And this is one of the reasons why people invented room darkening curtains, right? So you can sleep after the sun comes up, right? If you don't have those, it becomes difficult to sleep, right? So if you really want to like make sure you get up early every day, just sleep outside. The sun will just come right in on you and you'll just like pop right up, right? You'll be fine. But that sunlight coming into the hypothalamus gets your circadian rhythms triggered, right? And it says like, oh, it's daylight. So when it's daylight, it's time for you to be up. There's certain hormones that need to be released. You've got certain neurotransmitters. You know, those neurotransmitter levels vary between, different times of the day. And so that's really important. Folks who are depressed or have other sort of affective disorders, they sort of have like this screwed up circadian rhythm business, right? I mean, like what's one of the #1 symptoms of somebody if they're dealing with depression? It's like altered sleep, right? I mean, it's like one of their complaints, you know, they sleep at the wrong time, right? They often will wake up at, early when they shouldn't, right? Can't get back to sleep, or they'll get tired at other times during the day. It's really kind of interesting. And in fact, some of their hormone and neurotransmitter levels actually mimic individuals who are trying to flip their days and nights. Like there are some people who try to like flip their days and nights, right? Where if you are like traveling like to the other side of the planet, or maybe you're working like night shifts or something, and you need to kind of like, do a 12-hour shift in your daylight cycle or your active cycle. Folks who are depressed have similar sort of patterns of their hormones and neurotransmitters as folks who are doing that, which is really kind of interesting. On top of that, you can actually trigger manic episodes in folks who have bipolar by keeping them awake. So, if you have somebody who's coming in and is like, hey, I've been dealing with this, bipolar disorder thing for a while, I don't recommend they stay up for 2 days. That's bad news, right? Because then you could actually kick them in. Jack in the box, right? That's an induced jack in the box. But by keeping them awake.
I feel like I remember you saying in physio that like you can treat depression by keeping someone awake.
Yeah, that's true. It is. No, it really is. One of the probably the most effective treatment for depression is sleep deprivation. Sierra, it's not a great long-term solution, but it works, right? And it goes back to, again, these sort of circadian rhythms out of sync, and you need to try to get all of these things synced up, right? And so everything's like going how it should. And so if you keep these folks awake for a while, when they should go to sleep, they'll actually see an improvement in their depression. It'll last for a little while. I mean, it kind of varies from person to person. So there you go, right? Like new therapy. Forget all of that other stuff like sitting down trying to talk people through their problems. Just talk to them to keep them awake.
Just make sure they're not
I think the web
bipolar.
said it only lasts until they go to sleep, and then when they go to sleep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
It's not a great long-term strategy, like I said. It's not something you're going to do like for forever, right? It's like, well, you can feel better for the next 12 hours, or we can try this drug.
Sounds like meth would be a solution there. Set it up
Yes.
for 4 days.
Meth will take care of your depression, absolutely. It will absolutely take care of your depression. Now, it'll give you some other problems, like that stroke, heart attack, teeth falling out thing.
It's overrated.
Something more mild like cocaine. Just water down your cocaine a little bit. You guys are going to go tell Dr. Beard that. Somebody already told him I told you guys to do LSD.
No, we said if you were gonna do a drug, you said.
Well, that apparently didn't get through to him. When you go and telling my students to take LSD, that's not what I told them.
He tells us stuff like that too, so it's.
I know he does. You don't know what he'll tell you. Wait until you take his, I don't know class. He's just, right? I don't even know the title of it. Oh, it's a sex class. There you go.
I think that's the,
Is that the name of it?
that's the unofficial.
That's the unofficial
Oh, no
name.
way. Does it have a real name?
It just
always
calls
called
it
sex
sex.
class.
Sex and drugs. Sexual behaviors or
Is
something
it
like
rock
that,
and roll or
probably.
something? Is that part
It's
of
gonna
it?
be a great time.
No. Yeah.
Oh,
We're West
sorry.
Virginia.
That's
Excited.
different.
We're taking it with the group underneath us.
Underneath.
I wouldn't phrase it that way.
Underneath us. Both
All
of
right.
us.
Well, there you go, CRF. So Jason, again, like you said, it doesn't really work very well, right? Now, it will work. So it's great, like, I guess if you're like in the middle of, I don't know, like in the middle of a crisis, right? Maybe try to keep somebody awake for a couple days.
So they recommended sleep deprivation along with like medication. I think the combination works best.
The combination does work best, and we'll talk later about why it takes a while for medication to work, right? So if any of you have ever used like an antidepressant, or you know someone who has, I'm going to assume there's definitely all of you are in the second category, right? Given sort of your like line of work and such. If they start on an antidepressant, when do you anticipate they actually start to see an improvement in their mood?
4 to 6 weeks.
Yeah, it's like 4 to 6 weeks, right? It takes forever. And so the problem is, like, even in, as we talked about last week, in the meantime, things might actually get a little bit worse. While they're, I mean, it's just kind of like, hey, take this drug. It's going to fix your depression eventually. But first, you're going to feel horrible. Like even more horrible than you do now. So what we're going to do is we're going to stay awake for 3 days. And then we're going to try ketamine for a few days until this kicks in. So, because ketamine also is a great antidepressant. Also not a great long-term solution. What's interesting though about ketamine is it actually, in some folks, it can last up to 3 months. A ketamine treatment, like one kind of dose of ketamine, which is really kind of impressive, right? Given that, you can't take a, Prozac and let that work for 3 months.
How does that work? Why?
How does that work?
Ketamine?
Yes.
It actually induces some long-term synaptic changes. Because and we could talk about it in some detail later. But briefly, it interferes with, it interferes with the NMDA process, makes you do your glutamate processing through a different set of channels, and causes some changes in the synaptic strength. As described by...
Go ahead.
Absolutely. And so there's some actual long-term changes in ketamine can start those pretty quickly. They can hang around for a while. Some dendritic spine differences and things like that. So it's actually kind of interesting, right? I mean, now ketamine obviously has some negative, I was going to say connotations, but let's just say it's got some negative aspects, right? Connotations is kind of like, well, people just think it's negative. There are actually some negative things about ketamine, right? And there's some problems.
Yeah, well, I was wondering how that would affect
Yeah.
concurrent trauma.
Right. There's some problems. But they're actually looking at other sort of NMDA, other agents that affect NMDA processing and such. So it's kind of interesting. Like ketamine's probably not going to be like a widespread treatment, but there might be some derivative of that, right? And something that might come out of that based on what we know ketamine does. There are other substances that can be created that can do that, which is really fascinating. So there you go. And which is actually a sort of a common story with some of these other antidepressants, right? That people take. Some of them are like, hey, we're giving this to folks who have high blood pressure, and like all of a sudden they start feeling better as well, and they're like, oh, well, this really screws around with the way you package neurotransmitters, and we can kind of learn something from that. That's kind of cool, right? Accidentally. You guys went into the wrong business. You should have gone into the accidental drug business, where you just make drugs and give them to people and go like, oh, well, not only did we fix your high cholesterol, but, now you've got more energy, so there you go. Not a big deal. These are like plasma cortisol levels. You guys don't even know about this. Basically, when you have an early trauma in your life, it screws around with kind of your baseline for your HPA axis, right? That hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis we talked about last week, and that can really kind of make it over-responsive, right? And so later in life when something happens, even if it's not something, what most people would say like, oh, that's not very serious, it can really trip you over into to depression or some other disorder. Also, you can give folks dexamethasone. It's actually a synthetic glucocorticoid, right? So if I were to give this to most folks who are not depressed, this would actually sort of have some negative feedback on that corticotropin releasing factor process, right? And so you'd actually, so if I gave you dexamethasone, you would stop releasing CRF, right? Because it would be telling you, oh, I've got a ton of glucocorticoids here. I don't need to make any more glucocorticoids, so I'm going to stop, right? So most folks will actually start to have a suppression in their CRF release levels. Folks who are depressed don't have that. So depressed folks are not responsive to sort of that negative feedback process with glucocorticoids, so they keep making glucocorticoids, right, even though they shouldn't, and then those effects, those increased glucocorticoids cause you some problems. So there you go, you can kind of look at, cortisol levels do shift throughout the day, which is pretty awesome. See a nice little spike here early in the day. Cortisol being sort of gets you sort of a stimulant, right? So it kind of gets you up, gets you moving, right? It's a stress hormone. Really great to have that happen early in the morning. That encourages you to get out of bed, right? And do things, and then kind of trails off at night. If you notice these folks who are depressed, they have elevated levels across the board. But what I think is really interesting is the big gap here, sort of in that late night to early morning phase, right? We already talked about sleep disturbances in folks who are depressed, right? And so if they have elevated cortisol levels, that could be, partially responsible for some of those sleep disturbances. So there you go. This is out of the great book, Principles of Neural Science. You guys should buy that. It's a big, thick book. It's about like this. It's got a picture of a brain on the front. Eric Kandel. You guys know Eric Kandel? He won the Nobel Prize. It's pretty important. He figured out that sea slugs can remember if you've ever electrocuted them before. Kind of fascinating. He did a lot of work with like hippocampus and memory and learning memory. His family fled the invasion, when the Nazis came in. His family kind of fled that and then came to the U.S. They were in Austria. He's an old guy. He's like a super old guy. In fact, I don't think he's dead yet. He was alive a few years ago. He's nice guy.
He's just telling you.
Just telling you this. You're the only one who seems interested. So here you go. Here's plasma levels of cortisol. This is a non-depressed person after we gave them some dexamethasone. Here's a depressed person. There's no change, right? They're just going to keep shooting out the cortisol, even though we gave them that glucocorticoid that should have shut down that process, right? So they're not responsive. Their HPA axis is like, oh no, we don't think so. Cortisol all the way. We're just going to ride that out. There you go. What are some other problems in terms of sleep? Actually, some interesting problems with sleep, right? Folks who are depressed, they have the onset of sleep is delayed, right? So they try to go to sleep and they have trouble doing that. However, as soon as they, like in some very, very extreme cases, as soon as they go to sleep, they may go into REM sleep, right? Normally, you're not supposed to do that. Normally, you go to sleep, maybe 45 minutes, an hour later, after you've gone through some of your other sleep stages, you pop into REM sleep, you go through your other sleep stages. Folks who are depressed don't really get into that slow wave sleep very much, right? And that kind of stage 3, stage 4 business. If you don't know what that is, don't worry about it. It's just kind of like slow wave sleep. Your EEG gets a little more synchronized. But they go into REM sleep faster, especially earlier in the night. Most people, if you're not depressed, over the course of the night, you'll spend longer and longer in REM sleep, right? It's kind of good. Folks who are depressed spend longer in REM sleep early and then less in REM sleep later. What's also kind of interesting is, so why do they call it REM sleep? That's rapid eye movement. I just assumed you guys knew that. When, you or I would, assuming we're not depressed, for the course the rest of the day, we're going to assume we're none of us are depressed. Seems reasonable, right? So we would have kind of like, let's say moderate eye movements. Folks who are depressed have really intense eye movements. And that seems to be a correlate with how like intense your dreaming is, right? So if you have more intense eye movements, you're probably dreaming more intensely. So folks who are depressed seem to have more intense dreams as well, which may not be a good thing, right? As you can imagine. Depends on what you're dreaming.
It's cool from like a psycho down here. Like the systems.
I suppose. If that works for you, I don't even know what that is. I'm just gonna, if somebody comes into me and they say, hey, I'm depressed, first I'm gonna send them up to you guys on the 4th floor. Is that what I should do? I've got no skill set for it.
Should give them a drug. See what
I
it does.
should. I
See what it
should.
does.
It's like I pull out my desk drawer and I've got like vials of ketamine or something. Like, hold still. You know how like quickly I would lose my job if I were giving students ketamine in my office? It'd probably take a couple years. No, not yet. Not yet.
Yeah.
Next year, watch out.
Tenure.
Next year's my tenure year, so you guys come back when you're 4th or 5th years. I'll probably have some ketamine in my office for you. I got one drawer for ketamine, one drawer for LSD.
You forget, right? That ketamine, you have memory problems after you take
They won't be
it.
able to report
Yeah.
Yeah, they're not gonna report you. There you go.
You can say, though, they're doing ketamine.
Oh, Sierra,
You're helping them out.
we're cutting you in on this deal.
Appreciate that.
What he's thinking. So here you go, folks. Here's sort of, a sleep pattern without depression. Folks who are depressed, again, they spend a little bit more time in REM sleep early on. Not a big deal. So there you go. So when you go to sleep, you should not go into REM sleep immediately. Depressed folks do it pretty quickly. Might take you a couple hours to get into REM sleep. Well, actually, you're probably mostly in this age group. It's still going to take you a couple hours to get in there. So there you go.
Did we get there?
If you have bipolar disorder, you also got some screwed up sleep rhythms. That's not a big deal, right? You get so much work done because you're not sleeping. Folks in a manic, they stay awake and count all of the jelly beans in their 32-pound hippo crate of jelly beans. So they got things to do. Where are you going to sleep, right? Sleeping's for losers. You just stay awake. So there you go. However, guess what can put people to sleep, at any time? Benzodiazepines, right? That'll definitely get yourself in a manic phase. Just, take a benzo and you're good. Sounds like fun, right? There are other things that we do to treat bipolar disorder, right? We'll talk in some detail. Like the number one thing that they give folks is lithium, right? And that's pretty standard treatment. There are some side effects with lithium. We'll talk about some of that later. Hey, there's that suprachiasmatic nucleus for those of you that actually want to spell it. Isn't that fun? Circadian rhythms also control norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine. These are sort of three major systems that definitely have an effect on your mood. And those are actually three targets, intentional or otherwise, for antidepressants that people take, right? Primarily we think about serotonin, but some of the very early antidepressants targeted 2 or 3 of these neurotransmitter systems, and I can explain why they're not used anymore because of some of the severe side effects, right? Hey, who loves clock jeans? And I don't mean like pants with timepieces printed on them. That's what I was thinking about. I know, right? So there is this gene called clock. It controls like your circadian rhythms, right? And what we call a SNP, single nucleotide polymorphism. That's just sort of a mutation in that gene is definitely associated with bipolar symptoms, which is kind of interesting. There's like a whole bunch of stuff about that clock gene and knockouts and how they've created mice with clock gene knockouts and they have bipolar-like symptoms, which is actually kind of interesting. All right, so we already talked about construct validity, right? Other such forms of validity. I'm not going to doesn't really matter what kind of validity it is, right? But in these animal studies, we've talked about some of the advantages and disadvantages, right? I could tell you this great story about my friend who took a job with one of these like small pharmaceutical companies right out of getting his PhD. And so what they did is they were like a drug discovery group, right? So they would create and develop a drug, and then they would sell it to someone who would then market that and, you know, distribute it, right? And so they had this great, it was a small company, so they didn't do a lot. So they had this great antidepressant, and they gave it to rats, and these rats were just the happiest rats you've ever seen. I mean, they would just jump around, and they would, you know, I don't know, hopscotch, whatever it is happy rats do, right? And they did all these studies with rats, and I was like, wow, that's brilliant. So then the next thing you got to do is you got to do like clinical trials, right? So they started giving it to people. And the first time they gave it to some people, they were like, oh, these people feel a lot better. That's great, right? They actually saw some positive results. They're like, wow, this is awesome. Then you have to do like another clinical trial, right? And it was like, not so good, right? So it was kind of like so-so, right? It didn't really work on these people. You know, some people felt a little better, but nothing serious. So then their stock price kind of went down a little bit. So like, you know, you guys can't get it together on this, what's going on. They did their third clinical trial, and it absolutely did not help at all. And so then their stock price just fell out completely. What was interesting then is they, now again, they are a research and development company, right? And so this is important to the story. Their board of directors decided they were going to completely eliminate the research and development division of the company to try to save money. You can imagine 3 weeks later, the company no longer existed. So, I don't know, that was a depressing story. In case you're worried about my friend, he got a great job somewhere else. He's in St. Louis now doing some awesome stuff. So he's fine. I don't know about anybody else that worked there. Really mattered. So that's a good story, right?
Need some ketamine.
Not a big deal. So anyway, modeling, we're not going to talk too much about modeling, although we do try to create these models. We already talked about sleep deprivation, right? That was kind of fun in rats. If you delete that clock gene from these mice, you know, they'll act like they're having a manic episode. Again, do we know if that is, you know, really the problem or not the problem, right? I mean, so it's like, yes, it creates some mania in rats, but are these problems with the clock gene, you know, are they problems with humans as well? It's kind of interesting. Obviously, there's this is kind of interesting. There's like this burst firing in that mesolimbic dopamine pathway. Who remembers, Jessica, the mesolimbic dopaminergic pathway from the ventral tegmental area to the
NCAN. God. I was like going through
It's the abbreviation that always messes you up.
I know.
Why don't you just
It's the
say-
nucleus accumbens,
There
but
you
I don't know
go.
how to spell that. I know I say it wrong too.
Yeah, it's gonna be the only question you get on the final exam. It's gonna be like one
Yeah.
sheet. It's gonna have one question on
What's the
More than
abbreviation?
it. Everybody else is gonna get a different.
I know that it does something with the VTA, which is ventral tegmental area.
Yeah. So in folks who are having, or in these mice who are having these manic episodes, there also seems to be an increase in firing in that dopaminergic pathway, which would be why. How many of you have dealt with someone? Well, you guys have all talked about folks who have bipolar disorder, right? When they talk about their manic episodes, they talk about how horrible it was and how bad they felt,
No.
like how down in the dumps they were because they were so productive and energetic. No,
You don't want to take their meds.
Why would you want to? If you can just stay awake infinitely and buy jelly beans, I don't know why you would ever take your medicine, right? That seems like a life to me. Constantly staying awake with 32 pounds of jelly beans. What do you end up doing with the jelly beans?
I didn't ask. We have larger fish to fry than that.
That's a good way to build rapport. Talk about his jelly beans.
You know, you gotta stay very directed, because, yeah. A lot of ideas, as you can
A lot of
imagine.
ideas.
You could put them on the toilet seat to hold it down.
True.
Just thought of that.
Vertical.
You can use that.
I'm just paranoia with the toilet, so.
Oh, yeah.
He's afraid of the toilet?
Is that
In
him?
some way, yeah.
Oh my god.
How does that work?
I don't think it does.
Long story.
Just change your mind.
Well, all the same. Hey, this is kind of cool though. There's this glycogen synthase kinase 3, right? Nobody's going to remember that. GSK3. This guy's kind of cool. How many of you know what glycogen is? All right, Johnson Central, you want to tell us?
No.
No. Now, anybody have an idea? All right, Destiny, do you want to tell them?
No, I was nodding to something else.
Oh.
She wrote that.
I
it's
wrote
cool.
that GSK3 is cool.
It is,
That's
right?
what
It's
it
kind of cool. So glycogen, long-term storage molecule, right? You guys know about glucose and insulin, and you know you make stuff. You make glycogen out of that, right? Not a big deal.
So glucose makes glycogen.
Well, eventually you turn it into glycogen because you're going to store it up for a long period of time, right? But this is glycogen synthase kinase 3. This is like other enzymes that do stuff, so don't worry too much.
So it's not made by glucose.
Not this particular enzyme, no.
Made of
Glycogen
flour.
itself is made out of glucose, but not this enzyme. All the same, if you sort of overexpress this, right, if you start screwing around the GSK3, you actually start to get like manic behaviors in rats. And if you want to think about this, Jason, lithium actually will inhibit this process, right? So if we give these rats lithium, or mice lithium, where we've screwed around with their GSK3, then we can kind of, you know, once we give them the lithium, their mania disappears, right? And so if their mania disappears, everything like, well, when we give someone a human who's manic lithium, their mania disappears, right? So we think, well, maybe it's a similar mechanism. I don't say disappears, maybe. You can modulate these things, hopefully.
So what happens if they're not bipolar and they get
Who's
lithium?
bipolar?
If they're not,
person?
then they get lithium anyway.
I just need to drink a lot of water so you don't have any toxic effects of lithium.
Agreed, that'd be a good idea.
That's a true story. Most folks who take, like if you were to take lithium and you're not bipolar, it's not, you're not going to really see that.
What's that gonna do to like brain development?
Like if you're like 6 and you're taking lithium,
Exactly.
That's why I was
Jason.
That's why I was asking.
Yeah.
What if you're not?
yeah, what if you're 9? Is that
No, what if you're not bipolar and
and
they
you're
get to you at 6? That sounds like real fucked.
Yeah, how fucking
I know it wasn't Jason, he's not a prescriber. So you're
No,
not,
I mean as the victim.
oh, as the victim, as the lithium victim?
Victim.
So, like in adults, if you give someone lithium who's not bipolar, you're really not, right, it's not going to have any sort of neurological effect, right? Now, as a child, I don't know. Like during the developmental process, that's a different situation, right? And so that I don't know.
Real.
So who knows? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah. Well, I mean, lithium's like heavy business, right? Because lithium will just, man, it does a lot of stuff
So you know when like they have to get their levels checked?
constantly.
Yes.
That way, that's. Well,
What the hell is a
who
good
wants
level?
to talk
Because
about lithium now? Look at how many slides I have to skip ahead.
you don't have to. I can
Just
wait.
no, I do.
You brought up lithium, didn't you?
Yeah,
Yes.
you're the one that
Yeah,
brought
you
it
did.
up.
You opened this door.
I know I didn't bring up lithium.
What's a good level? I really need to know.
Whatever you're seeing, probably not that.
All right, lithium.
It's been taken.
again, if you're a person without bipolar, it's probably not going to do anything. It will typically reduce your manic episodes, not cause you depression. Sort of helps in the suicide business. Hold on, I thought I had a slide where it told you like the. Unfortunately, I think it's like 1.2 millimolar.
It's like an okay rate, or that?
Yeah. Just look at appropriate lithium levels. What is a safe level of lithium? Yeah, so like 1.2, 0.8 to 1.2 is okay. When you get sort of higher than that, you run into some serious problems. You'll know if that person's lithium is too high or getting too high. You have to kind of modulate that. You'll have some real serious problems.
What is that unit of measurement, the 0.8 to the 1.2?
I'm sorry, what?
What is that unit of measurement?
It's like typically it's like millimoles per liter. No, that's terribly helpful.
Yeah. I remember learning.
Yeah, I know it sounds made up, but it's not. It's like a real thing. But after I started to tell you about it, I realized like that.
What can I compare that to? What's a visual representation of that?
Miles per hour. You could kind of think about it just like how much. So like if you were to take like a liter of blood, like how much of that's going to be lithium, right? Does that help? That's how I would visualize. Like what percentage of the blood is lithium? It's going to be like super small, so you're never going to express it as a percentage. So you're going to express it as some other sort of concentration, right? Kind of like you understand parts per million, right, or something like that. It's kind of similar. But yeah, and there are different sort of. I mean, these are saying some different. Levels. It looks like 0.2 is kind of the bottom end. You don't want to risk relapse, but you can run into some toxic levels. Let's see. I think I can find something legitimate here. Lithium toxicity.
This might be a stupid question, but everyone has some lithium in their blood, right?
Maybe that's mercury.
I'm asking.
For a friend?
No, so you don't metaphor. Not like that. Right? No?
I mean,
I'm just trying to say, so on this person's chart it says like this is how much lithium is in their blood.
yeah.
But like, is there normally, like, does everyone have some in their blood? I really don't know.
I mean, it's possible. I mean, I wouldn't anticipate most folks going in and testing positive for lithium.
Okay.
Is that just like a basic thing on everyone's
I mean, unless you're
chart?
like
Is that
eating
what
rechargeable
No.
batteries
We
or
don't think
something.
he's following his medication.
It's like, no. Yeah. So I mean, I think.
No, they don't get all tested.
That's what I was asking. What's the half-life on that?
The half-life of lithium?
That sounded smart.
That did. Serum elimination half-life can vary between 12 and 27 hours. If you have chronic intoxication, it could be in there up to 48 hours.
Mm-hmm.
If you're old, maybe as long as 58 hours. How about that? I know, right? So don't give old people lithium or as much lithium. And that's one reason it's like important to, because again, like lithium toxic, I mean, you really have some, lithium's pretty powerful. Again, it's going to prevent norepinephrine release and enhances its reuptake. So you're like sucking up a bunch of norepinephrine, right? So that's kind of interesting.
Does it increase cell volume in certain parts?
Lithium?
Yeah.
It's possible. And the reason it's possible is lithium actually isn't metabolized, right? So most things that you take that are drugs are metabolized, but lithium, for those of you that don't know, lithium is an
ion.
yeah, it's an ion. Right? So it's like nothing to metabolize it to unless you're like doing like
Lithium-ion
nuclear
batteries.
fission or something, right?
Why do they call it that then? Why do they call them lithium-ion batteries?
Lithium. You can also get lithium that's not an ion.
It's good marketing.
I mean, you can get lithium that's neutral if you've like,
Why does it power things?
well,
What power does it hold?
well, it works just like any other sort of like acid, right? Because it's got, because the acids and bases have positive and negative charges, and you're moving ions and flow of electrons and so forth. Is that a good enough answer?
Sure. Yeah.
So it does a lot of things. It also, which is actually kind of sort of interesting, it actually has an inhibitory effect on adenylate cyclase in your G proteins, right? So when we think about like lithium sort of changing the way neurotransmitters work, Jessica, a lot of the way this works is through those like second messenger systems, right? So maybe not by directly blocking a neurotransmitter system, but by screwing around with any of those second messengers, they're going to carry that, in sort of a metabotropic receptor situation, right?
Why don't ions get metabolized? I missed that.
It's an ion. It is a single atom. It's like a single atom of an element. There's nothing to break it into, but like, I mean, you'd have to literally bust it up into protons and neutrons. That's all there is left.
Okay. So it just sits there.
Quarks.
And it's string.
See, I knew I should have
Yeah,
asked.
well, That's okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It doesn't. So like when you take like another drug, right? And you take like
It's like the little circles that the pictures are, right? Other drugs are a couple of circles strung together.
so
Yes.
yeah, Megan, that was close.
Thank you.
So let's find something here that might, okay. So these are
Yeah, not bad.
your tricyclics, right? Like your TCAs, right? These are sort of they're sort of like the second wave. They gave MAOIs first to treat depression, and then they came out with these tricyclics, right? If I were to give you one of these tricyclics, look at like every one of these corners, like every time there's a point, right? That represents, like there's an atom there, right? So everywhere you go, like here, I really thought that was going to work. Like here, everywhere there's like a change in direction, that represents an atom, right? So, these are different, like here's a nitrogen, right? For example, these are typically carbons, unless it tells you otherwise, right? So those are going to be carbons.
Carbons bind well.
Yeah, carbon.
That's what you're made out of.
Going down this path, right? So the interesting thing about carbon is carbon has, so you guys know like valence shell electrons, right? Okay, so like that outer shell of electrons, typically for like your purposes, you can assume that you want to put 8 electrons out there, right?
Makes it happy.
It does, right? So there you go. Carbon is really awesome because carbon has 4 electrons, right, out in that valence shell. So that gives it 4 opportunities to bind with other atoms. So you can create these complicated sort of structures. If you were to move one place or the other, then maybe you only have 1 or 2 places where you could bind with another. Like, so if you look at nitrogen, for example, here, it can only make 3 connections, right? Because it has 5.
I'm with you now. I remember.
Okay.
That was a very long time ago.
My high school chemistry teacher went on maternity leave after the first month of the year. I taught the rest of my high school chemistry class. What?
Do it. Just do it. There you go.
I've never had hair long enough to flip. So if you were to take just like one of these atoms, that's lithium, right? So lithium is just like I mean, it's actually lithium carbonate, but don't worry about that. Just don't worry about it. about it.
Don't
worry about it.
overthink it.
Just let it go and just assume what I told you is true, and we'll be happy.
Good thing we
All right.
have to prescribe.
But
Okay.
one of the ways that lithium works is, particularly on this adenylate cyclase, right? And so it kind of inhibits that second messenger system, and keeps it from spreading those signals in those cascades, right? So you might still get the effects of whatever neurotransmitter it is directly, right? But you're not going to get those broader effects that are going through the those other second messenger cascades and so forth. Is that cool? That's what I thought, right?
Do they use lithium to treat other things besides depression and bipolar? Because, yeah, that's, I don't,
Not typically. I mean, not that I'm aware of typically. I mean, somebody may have at some point. I'm not going to doubt
have you
that.
ever heard of it used to treat autism, like severe behavior problems in autism?
It's not common, but it is used sometimes if there are severe behavioral problems, like you said, in autism, or just in regular, like, super
Yeah.
disruptive, kind of like conduct problems.
That's what I'm thinking, like with mania, you can't really control that, like you're just
Yeah.
let it go. If that's all it is, like if you have something else that you can't control.
I feel like they just throw it at people if they don't know what's wrong with them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Here,
I
have some
mean,
lithium.
Let's see what
Fuck it.
sticks.
you can do that.
Let's see what sticks.
Yeah.
To the drawer.
Yeah.
Kimberly?
That's a problem too. So there you go.
How do they like, where do they get it?
What do you mean? Where do they get it?
Well, like some medicines and things are like, they come from plants or whatever, or you make them in a lab. Where do you get lithium?
It's
how
like a
do you-
salt.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe. A battery. Yeah, they bust open rechargeable batteries and just pour out the guts.
That'd be cool.
Just give it to people. So if you want to like save money on treatment, just go buy some energizers.
That kind of lithium is highly reactive to water.
Yeah. You want to package it appropriately so it works. Can't take it with water. So speaking of water and lithium, in fact, you should take a lot of water with your lithium. And the reason for that is because lithium is an ion just like sodium. What happens if you don't drink enough water, you'll actually start reabsorbing the lithium into your body, right, through your kidneys, instead of urinating it out. Okay.
How much water?
Like 12 gallons.
That was a serious question.
I mean, you shouldn't.
I mean, how much above like normal?
I think just a normal, but you just have to worry about dehydration,
Okay.
right? So you just have to worry, like, especially because it can cause sweating, it can cause other things because it, has some effect on some of your other systems. So you definitely just want to make sure that you're actually drinking enough water.
Do they have to replace other stuff too then? Like if it causes sweating and stuff like that, do they need like to replace the sodium and the...
Not typically. I mean,
So I'm wondering if it's like full on dehydration or they just need more water?
I mean, most folks
The
will.
same thing.
You can. I mean, if you're on a low salt diet, yes, it can cause you a problem because of how much. But if you're on like a normal diet, it's probably not. So, most people have too much salt anyway, so it's probably not a problem for most folks. However, if somebody comes in and they're also on a low salt diet for some high blood pressure issues or something, then that might be a concern. But in general, I mean, you don't have to worry about it a whole lot, but you do have to keep that in mind. And you do have to do those, blood tests constantly, right? Let's see. What about babies if they get lithium in their system? That's bad, right? There's a nice little note about that. Lithium will cross the placenta, can cause some cardiac defects, right? That's not good. And then if you're breastfeeding your kid and you're taking a bunch of lithium, that can cause some problems as well. You don't want those lethargic kids.
tablet. Easier to manage.
There you go.
So they're supposed to go off of it if someone's
Well,
pregnant?
that's always like the gamble, right? So, I mean, I didn't really intend to have this sort of conversation either today. But, I mean, Cassie, we might as well have it, right? Because I think it's actually an important consideration. And so I think, if you're dealing with someone who is, well, if they're taking any kind of psychotropic medication, and they decide they want to have a child, or they have a child, right? Some people have them and haven't decided they're going to have a child. That happens, right?
That's for drinking more than usual.
Again, I mean, we decided that's how some of you made it here. It's like, whoa, man, that was a great concert. I know how these things work. And then some of you have like a younger sibling just to make it look right. I don't know if anybody's in that category.
My parents didn't want children and stopped at 1, so they didn't try to cover.
They didn't try to cover it. They were just like, whoa.
They're like, we're just gonna
Learned our lesson the first time. Let's get this
We're gonna go with
taken
this. We're not
care
gonna
of.
try to cover it up.
Yeah. I don't know, my idiot parents wanted a bunch of kids for some reason. What was wrong with
How many siblings do you have?
I actually have one biological sister, then I have 2 siblings who are adopted. So there's like 4 of us total.
That's not too many.
Yeah, I mean, it's not too many.
Yeah. Not enough to call your parents idiots for. Yeah, picturing
Well, they
10.
wanted,
Yeah,
they
I know.
wanted like a, I mean, they wanted like a large family.
Basketball team or something.
I don't know. I think after like my sister, they decided like, well, this isn't gonna work. I think there were some mechanical difficulties during the birthing process that was not advised for a repeat. Just one sequel is all there was to that. So
Wow. And where are you in that?
I'm the first.
You're the
Nice.
oldest.
Nice.
So we should have this conversation though about like giving pregnant women drugs, because just about any psychotropic medication, if it'll cross the blood-brain barrier, it'll also cross that baby blood barrier, right? Also known as the placenta. Yeah, so you never heard it called that, did you?
That's a good one.
Yeah, it is. That's exactly what it is, right? It's a baby blood barrier. I mean, it's, and it just passes right through there, right? Which is like further evidence that that thing's part of you until it falls out, right? And you ought to get to do with it what you want, up until the point it falls out of you, and then there's some other rules you have to follow.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. Great job, West Virginia. You guys did it right this time. No, nobody's saying anything. Everybody's making the same face. They're all
It's
going,
really sad. It's sad. Kind of
it
scary.
is really sad, right?
Yeah.
Good news, we're in the tri-state.
Yeah.
Off the bridge and get your abortion.
Because they're all over the place there in Proctorville. Ashland. Yeah. Actually, I think there's only one abortion clinic in the state of Kentucky. You gotta drive all the way to Louisville to get there.
I'll just push you down the stairs.
Can't you like get it out
I
of
got
hospital?
you.
Like,
No, no.
oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Especially when you go to one of those like Catholic hospitals.
Yeah.
Those folks won't rip anything out of you. You can't even like seriously, like you can't even go in there and have like, hey, I don't want to have kids anymore. You think you can like tie up a couple things for me? You can't even get one of those jobs done at a Catholic hospital. This was a problem when I went to graduate school. Some genius decided they were going to take the Catholic hospital, the Jewish hospital, and the university hospital, and it's like make one giant big entity out of that, right? Which sounds great because you're like, well, you can pool all these resources. Except for the problem is, there was like a Catholic hospital and a Jewish hospital, and then like a secular hospital, right? And it was like, this really isn't going to work, folks. So maybe we should pass on that.
It's a Catholic, not a Catholic hospital, but a Catholic man who's a doctor who won't give girls the Plan B pill after they've been raped at one of the hospitals back home.
Really?
Yeah, he's like, no, that's not
Yeah.
God's will.
You probably won't
He
even pass
wanted
out
you to
condoms.
get raped, for
Yeah.
sure.
Is that legal?
Back and thanks.
No, I don't
Oh.
know, but
Hey,
no one ever
Olivia,
did
I know it's a real
anything.
shocker to you. People do things that aren't illegal all the time.
Right. I'm
Okay, I just
curious.
wanted to
I'm just curious.
pass
if-
that
I
over.
think it is like at your
Yeah,
discretion
like,
thing.
can
It
you
is
legally
You can
deny
use
someone?
religion for anything. You're
Yeah,
like, well,
that's
it's my religion, bitch.
Yeah.
Except the flu shot.
You
making a lot of paperwork to get out of that. Well, that's good to hear. Nobody's getting the flu.
For me.
But again, Kristen, because we're giving these drugs to pregnant mothers, right? You have to really weigh the costs and the benefits, right? I mean, you know, you might think like depression. Okay, you think, well, okay, well, let's, you know, is it mild depression? Is it severe depression? How suicidal is this person? But then you get into other disorders like seizure disorders, right? And some of those can be fatal, and some of those can even be detrimental to the fetus. And you think, well, do I let this person continue to take valproic acid for something? Do I continue to let them take these other drugs? You know, what do I do, right? How do you advise these people? And I think, I'm just glad that's a decision I don't have to make. I mean, seriously, because it's a tough decision, right? And you really have to weigh out the costs and the benefits. And I hate to be the person, because I don't want to sound like a eugenicist, but, you know, on some level you want to really caution people who are taking psychotropic medications, like, look, you know, this can have some serious effects on your child. You're taking these medications, and if you really want to, you know, plan for this, you know, let's try some strategies to get you off these drugs. Let's try to do that for a few months before we get into something. In case you aren't aware, having a child can, you know, obviously alter hormone levels and cause some other things, and you may make things worse, may make things better, right? You know, you don't really know. It's not something I wouldn't recommend having a child as a remedy, just for anything.
But only for your marriage.
Yeah, that works.
That always works.
Every time.
Or to trap your high school boyfriend.
That actually is an effective strategy.
Also true.
Which I didn't really want to get into a whole conversation about, like, how you hide your menstrual cycle from us, but that's a true story. It's an interesting story, right, Montana? I mean, it's like hiding menstrual cycles.
What? Okay.
Wait, you
I don't.
You really want to know?
Yeah, I need you to elaborate.
All right. So, like in a lot of other species, like chimpanzees, for example, so you guys know what a menstrual cycle is, right? I guess I should start there. So, like every 4 weeks, there's like 3 or 4 days where there's an egg down in the uterus, right? And it's just like waiting to be fertilized. I know that Johnson Central Education probably didn't take you through this, Kyle. Just hang in there. This is going to be important for you. If it gets fertilized, then it, like, you know, turns into Charles or whatever you name your kid, right? Charles is a reasonable name for a person, right?
Oh, man.
If it doesn't get fertilized, then you, like, wrap it up with the inside of your uterus and you dump it out, right? And so that's how that goes. And again, you do that like every 28 days plus or minus whatever your personal variability is, right? So everybody's got some different sort of, and sometimes it varies from month to month, right? If you're not, you know, if you're not on some sort of hormonal birth control, you might have some variation in this, right? If you have too much variation, you need to get one of those sticks, and you need to check things. Because I really worry sometimes that you don't have a full conception of this. I know conception was a great word to slip in.
Can you draw it?
I mean, I could.
Please try.
Why are people hiding them? That was the main question.
So
You
here's,
can't see it. It's
We know where they are.
so let me get to this story. So so I had to tell you, like, there's like 3 or 4 days, right, where you've got an egg down there that can be fertilized, right? It's going to be, so you got like a little window then, right, where you could, where this could happen. In a chimpanzee, when this happens, when they put their egg down in their uterus and are like, hey, this can be fertilized, they'll turn their, like, external genitalia and surrounding regions bright red, right? So it'll just turn bright red, there's increased blood flow, right? See, and now you're making this face like, you should not turn bright red down there, right, as a human, unless, you know, if you do, you need to get that checked. So in chimpanzees and a lot of other species, you get that bright red signal, like, hey, I'm fertile. So the male chimpanzee will come over and start, you know, like, bringing flowers and chocolates, right? And they'll start, like, being nice, and they'll try to copulate. That's what they do. In humans, on the other hand, humans have evolved such that we don't, as a species, sort of broadcast when we're fertile, right? And I think if you would even ask, like, had you not, like, read a textbook, like, you wouldn't know when you're fertile, right? You wouldn't know, like, just intuitively, like, like, boy, I got an egg down there, because there's no way to know, right? And so why this is, Olivia, is so you can trap your mate, right? Because what is no, this is clearly a true story.
Okay.
What's one thing that will, like, just as a heads up, and I'm not, like, saying you should do this, what is one thing that will keep someone around for, like, an extended period of time is the possibility that they can make you pregnant, right? Because as a species, we're trying to procreate, right? That's like our drive, right? Even if you've decided consciously not to do that, there's some subconscious drive, right, that sort of, makes you participate in certain activities, right? Sex. That's that activity. It wasn't like biking or something.
Trying to figure out.
So hang in there.
It's more than the subconscious drive, it's pleasure.
Which is just, again, for this other reason. So hang in there.
Okay, all right, I'm here.
Right, so hang in there. So if your mate doesn't know when you're fertile, guess what they'll do? They'll stay around all the time and try to impregnate you and or keep someone else from impregnating you. Because the last thing they want to do is raise somebody else's child. True story, right? So you wouldn't want to raise somebody else's child, so like, hey, I'm going to hang around and either prevent you from becoming pregnant from this other guy and or impregnate you myself, right? That's pretty smart, right? Now, what if you have a kid already, right? And so you're like, oh man, when that kid does come out, that's a lot of effort. Have any of you ever taken care of a child?
Like babysat?
It's awful. Yeah, of any sort, right? Or seen it on TV. You saw that movie Mr. Mom with Michael Keaton? That was a joke just for us, Jason.
Cheaper by the dozen.
Cheaper by the dozen. The remake.
The remake.
The remake?
Yeah.
Oh, most certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Trust me, Dennis Quaid was not in the original. Dennis Quaid probably wasn't I don't know, now with that Botox he may have been. I don't think he was alive when the original was made. I'm not sure. Maybe he was. He was probably quite young. Anyway, so by like hiding when you have your menstrual cycle, like when you're fertile, right? Your mate will stay around, and when they're staying around, they'll bring those other resources that they have, right? So they'll help you take care of any offspring you do have. They can help you, gather other resources, protection, provide, foodstuffs and so forth. So as a species, because our foodstuffs. Because we want our brains to be really big, right? But our hips are not that big, right? So if our hips were wider, we wouldn't be as fast. And so this is like some other trade-off about like being able to walk and run really fast. Humans are the best runners out there, right? When it comes to, I know you don't think that, right? But we are phenomenal. Hang in there. We're phenomenally. Yes, it is about birthing hips. We're phenomenally good runners, and so we don't want wider hips or we lose that efficiency, right? We're not as mobile. So we're born sort of underdeveloped, right? And we're born underdeveloped so our brains can continue to expand once we come out of the birth canal, right? So the birth canal is about as wide as it can be, and we're still really fast, right? If it was wider, we'd be slower. We could probably afford that now, but evolution's a little slower than, like, inventing cars.
Goldilocks situation.
It is, right? It's Goldilocks situation. So, because the baby comes out undercooked, you need some help taking care of it and protecting it. And so a great way to do that is not let that person know when you're fertile, so they'll like continue to try to impregnate you all the time, even on those like 22 days when you're not fertile. So that's why you hide your menstrual cycle.
That was amazing.
I know. Probably won't be on the exam.
Only the things that I've learned will not be on the exam.
But you've learned so much in this class, right?
Well, you make me feel bad about my questions, but that's okay.
We're just a bunch of lampshades.
Lampshades.
So, Olivia, you are trying to trap someone.
Always.
You specifically.
Actually, never mind.
Otherwise, that was you as a species.
Okay.
Right.
Oh my gosh.
All right, that was actually an interesting question.
What was the
What was the
question?
question?
Who started this?
What was the question?
Lithium?
Oh, I asked if you could take lithium while you're pregnant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's how we got to hiding menstrual cycles?
Yeah.
It's because I said the comment,
Oh.
the trapping. I thought that was
But,
pregnant.
You didn't
I don't
know.
mind.
but again, you do have to be careful when you're, when you're dealing with your clients and they are pregnant or they want to become pregnant, right? The other thing is, let's say they find out they are pregnant and they decide, well, I'm going to keep the child. Okay, that's their choice, right? Whatever they want to do.
Can't get an abortion now, so.
Yeah, they're stuck with
Not
Charles.
really their choice anymore.
They're stuck with Charles. aren't they? Stuck with Charles.
So sad.
It is sad.
Is that just on like West Virginia's ballot?
Yeah.
Yeah, now they made
Yeah.
it a constitutional amendment.
Even in cases of.
You are no longer
emergency
in charge of your
incest
uterus.
Yeah, everything. All reasons.
Move back to Ohio.
Oh, I'm staying here.
Get rid of the state.
I think that's what everybody's been saying for a couple decades. Yeah, nobody's staying here. So the point is, if they decide to keep the child, right, they're going to be pregnant, then you have to worry about telling them to like stop the drug immediately, or do they taper off? Do you try some other replacement that maybe doesn't seem to have as many problems? I don't know. The problem is, Cassie, largely we have no idea what these drugs are doing to babies, right? I mean, we don't know. Nobody's given me their babies to study.
By the time
That's
they
where
probably tell you,
Charles
it's
can
probably too
go.
late, right?
Yeah.
No
Charles
general
is-
period.
There we
No,
go. We
nobody
can
wants-
find some positives out of this. Give all your unwanted babies to Dr. Dave Brown to study.
Should have put
Make
that on the
science.
constitutional
There we
amendment.
go.
Not letting you have an abortion, but that means I get some babies. Put those things to good use. Give me that squishy brain.
Oh. You just made it weird.
I mean, the nice thing about a baby's head is it's not solid yet, so you can really get in there pretty easily.
Oh my
You
god.
see the- oh my God. You don't have to drill through the solid scalp, the
Okay,
skull.
we got
Just a
that.
fact.
That's just a fact, man. What are you gonna do? That's why I always tell, like, you should tell your clients too, don't hit your kids on the head until they're at least 2 years old.
Well,
You gotta give that bone time to solidify on the top, right? You don't want them having a lumpy head.
Or maybe you do when you're hitting them. So.
yeah.
You just have to buy them hats and pay more for haircuts. Let's see, we talked about gene variant, it's not a big deal. Clock gene, dopamine pathway, we talked about this. Oh, hey, there was this original hypothesis was like, hey, I bet monoamines are the problem, right? And the idea was that they actually gave these folks this drug that reduces high blood pressure, but it also causes them to have depression, right? So blood pressure goes down, but you do too. So there you go, right? That was actually on the bottom. What's interesting about that is it prevents packaging neurotransmitters into vesicles, right? So it just leaves them out floating in the cytoplasm there, and then your monoamine oxidase, which is an enzyme that breaks up monoamines, chops them up. So it'll knock down your dopamine, your norepinephrine, and your serotonin levels. Not a big deal. So you think, okay, it's got to be monoamines, right? Makes some sense. Later, when they actually developed monoamine oxidase inhibitors and TCAs, they realized that, hey, these things work because they increase norepinephrine and serotonin levels, right? And so that's cool, and they can actually like reverse that problem with the packaging of those neurotransmitters in the vesicles. So it makes you think, oh, okay, well definitely it's going to be those neurotransmitters are playing a role. That's a pretty simple approach, right, to depression. Like, oh man, it's just because you got low monoamines. Let's get those things jacked up. So there are other things that are going on as well. A lot of stuff is spent on serotonin. There's also folks who do like the tryptophan depletion challenge. This is not like an ice bucket challenge. I wouldn't recommend doing this. Basically what you do is you eat a tryptophan deficient diet, right? And that can actually knock down your serotonin levels by a massive amount, right? What's kind of cool is in folks who have depression, if they're not currently being treated, like medicated for it, it'll actually give them depression. So, you know, if you think like, oh man, I got this guy cured, he's leaving me and he's not taking any, he's not taking his SSRI anymore, you know what I need to do? I need to get him a shot of that tryptophan-free amino acid substance so I can get him back into a relapse and keep that client longer.
Ethical.
Ethical? What's ethical?
It's not.
Oh. Yeah, it's not, but that's how that would work if you tried that. Now, the issue is, folks who don't have depression, though, that doesn't really seem to induce depression in them, right? So if you don't have depression, or you don't have like a family history of depression, and you try that tryptophan depletion business, it doesn't really seem to cause you a problem, right? It doesn't really seem to give you depression. So it really seems as though serotonin only is an issue in folks who are already vulnerable for some reason, right? So there's some other vulnerability that they have. It's kind of interesting. How many of you know about the serotonin reuptake transporter? That's a cool guy, right? There are actually two versions of this. There's like the long version and the short version. You can get tested to see which one you have. If you've got a couple of the short versions, they don't work very well. Yeah. So that's kind of interesting. They've done receptor binding studies. There actually seems to be an increase in serotonin receptors in folks who have depression. And this is a compensatory mechanism because of that decreased serotonin function. They're going to try to upregulate the receptors so they can take advantage of whatever serotonin is available. So that's cool, right? You guys think that's fun? Don't worry about this too much. Oh, we should talk about autoreceptors. Right, this is interesting. So autoreceptors will actually, when they're activated, they'll cause the reduction in the release of a neurotransmitter, right, whatever that is. So if you activate your serotonin autoreceptors, guess what? You stop releasing serotonin. Now the problem is, if you start giving someone a drug that increases their serotonin levels, it'll start activating their autoreceptors for serotonin, and they'll start releasing less of their own serotonin. I know, right, Destin? You're like, oh, that's bad. The only thing that helps is over time your autoreceptors become desensitized, and so you do eventually see an uptick. This is one of the reasons that you see that 4 to 6 week sort of window before you start to see improvement in folks who take SSRIs, right? Part of that mechanism is you have to get past that autoreceptor desensitization period. So it's the same idea with these guys who take like testosterone supplements, right? So if you take a testosterone supplement, well, whatever, it'll raise your testosterone levels up until the point that it doesn't, because it'll start telling your testicles to make less testosterone. Yeah, so then you have problems. So watch out for that. I don't know if anybody's trying testosterone supplements right now. Just looking around, I can see who's like, you know, shirt sleeves are bulging.
Not this corner.
Hey, speak for yourself.
Maybe that's
I could-
It happens.
Our students said they're afraid of you because they saw you in the gym. And they
Oh,
said you
no.
looked really mean. And angry.
She is.
All right, what else do we got?
You put your
Norepinephrine.
toothpaste on and go in there.
Problem with norepinephrine, these things have been kind of tricky, right? And if you treat somebody with a norepinephrine agonist, you know, it takes a little while before you see the sort of effect. Not all of them seem to work. Now people kind of think norepinephrine and serotonin work together. They kind of modulate each other, and that causes some effect. There's the locus ceruleus for you, Megan, just as a
Gotcha.
reminder to those, you know, Days in Nelson's class.
I already said lithium, it's just been roller coaster.
I know. You gotta see what you can do.
Her autoreceptor dance that she
Her
did.
auto dance, I forgot
Yeah.
that.
No, a lot of things are coming up for me right now.
Hey,
You can just power through.
is the clinic still open? We can send you up to the 4th floor.
That works.
For 15 more minutes.
If you need to go,
It'll be quick.
if you need to go, you can do that. They have some ketamine up there for you. She told me once she got pulled over with cocaine in her pocket.
That makes sense.
But it was from the lab. She always wore this like sweater vest with pockets, right? It was like a button-up cardigan, I guess. And she would put like, you know, things in her pockets instead of wearing a lab coat. And so she said one day she had like a small vial of cocaine in there because, you know, she drives like 400 miles an hour. I don't know if you've ever tried to follow her somewhere. She would tell us like, don't follow me because I drive too fast. And then she would just take off like at literally 90 miles an hour. So it's a surprise.
But that looks good with the cocaine.
Well, thankfully, she said she was like, I think it's the only time she's ever been nervous. She said she was, well, that when she met B.F. Skinner, which was a whole different story. Would that make you nervous? Meeting B.F. Skinner?
Pulled over? Yes.
Oh, if you had cocaine, you got pulled over, yeah. So Megan, she told me once, you know, she has B.F. Skinner's autograph. Yeah.
She's gotten a lot less coherent, so.
Yeah, that
Probably old age.
yeah, she's pretty old, actually. She said she met B.F. Skinner, and she said, she looked at me and she said, John, I could have asked him anything. I could have asked him anything about, you know, his theories, about how reinforcement works, and she said, the only thing I can get out is, can I have your autograph?
She fangirl.
That's the most human thing I've ever heard about her.
It is, isn't it? It's such a touching story for me. I try to share it with everyone who knows her.
I don't know that it helps much at this point. A little bit.
There you go. If you guys knew this woman,
Who you're all talking
listen.
I'm guessing it's
Oh.
she's white.
What?
What happened with the cocaine? Did they know she had cocaine?
No, they didn't check her pockets. I mean, she wasn't on cocaine.
She's white.
Are you sure?
No,
She's not white?
she's Korean.
Huh.
Her
Practically
last name's
white.
White.
Yeah.
Well.
Even less suspicious.
Even less She probably just stared him down with her laser eyes. She might have melted the guy's face.
She's terrified and he drove away.
That's right. She was
Sorry for
pregnant.
trouble.
Let's see.
She gave him a ticket.
She probably can write people tickets. She has that power.
Kyle looks traumatized.
I am.
We talked about glucocorticoids. Hey, one of the problems is, like if you have a bunch of glucocorticoids floating around, your brain cells start to die. Yeah, that's troublesome, right? Especially according to the hippocampus. It really seems to be sensitive to glucocorticoids. Right there you go. The nice thing is, if you give antidepressants to at least rats, that corticotropin releasing factor level drops, right, which is great, and you'll actually start to get some of your hippocampal dendrites back, right? So you'll start to regrow those, which is kind of exciting. I thought I had a picture of that, but I don't. BDNF, how many of you love BDNF? Everybody should raise your hand on that one. That's brain-derived neurotrophic factor, right? That's awesome. Helps you out with like dendritic branches. Antidepressants will actually prevent the decrease of BDNF. They won't necessarily increase your BDNF levels, but it will reduce the loss of it in the hippocampus in particular. Hey, there you go. There's like a normal cell, and here's like a cell with other things. You guys get the point. I want to make sure we get through this. I only surprisingly have 30 minutes left. Once again, you guys have decided to talk about things other than what I think about, but I think they were helpful nonetheless. We could talk about epigenetics if you want. Skip past that. We need to talk about any of this stuff. We should talk about, though, specific drugs, right, that are used to treat depression and so forth. We talked a good bit about lithium, so I think we can kind of bypass that lithium conversation again. MAOIs, They are monoamine oxidase inhibitors. They inhibit the breakdown of monoamines, increasing monoamines. It goes back to that monoamine hypothesis, right? Not a big deal. So you have more monoamines, that's dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin are going to be released from the synapse. So that's pretty awesome. Now there are some problems, of course, with MAOIs, right? Blood pressure, sleep disturbances. I mean, we've already got screwed up sleep anyway. Overeating and weight gain, and that seems to be a big issue with MAOIs. That's always great for people's depressions, right? Massive weight gain. Pull you right out of feeling bad about yourself. Slap on 30 to 40 pounds, feel great. No, most people, and I would say probably like 5 out of 4 people are concerned about weight gain. Because some of you are concerned for like 1.5 to 2 peoples, right? Because some people are overly concerned about it. But most people would not say, yeah, I'll feel better about myself if I gained weight, right? Most people feel bad about that. It's kind of, unfortunately, standard thing. Almost like an intermediate sneeze.
Jessica's got wild ones.
You know what?
So there you go. Also, a problem with MAOIs is you're already jacking up your norepinephrine levels. So if you start taking other drugs that screw around with your norepinephrine levels, you can cause some serious problems. So you might think like cocaine and amphetamine, sure, but the other problem is like cold medications, right? Anti-asthma drugs, all of these will sort of influence norepinephrine levels as well. That's why on just about every over-the-counter medication that you can purchase, I don't know if anybody has some over-the-counter medication with them, like some cold medication, it probably says on the back, if you're taking an MAOI, don't take this drug.
Probably.
Probably. Most drugs do, because most drugs will interfere with that. It may not. That may have a different mechanism. It may not be a problem.
It does.
It does. It says it right there. Yeah. If you're taking an MAOI, don't take this drug. That goes for every drug, Jason.
If you're not taking a prescription monoamine oxidase inhibitor for depression, psychiatric, or emotional conditions, or Parkinson's disease, do they use it for Parkinson's?
It increases dopamine levels, yeah.
That makes sense. Don't take it.
Again, there are other things you can take for all of those. MAOIs are not sort of the first line, right? If somebody's on an MAOI, that's one of your clients, you might want to look at their medication history just to make certain they've tried other things first, right? And they should have. They should have tried a variety of other things before they go to MAOIs because of the side effects. Because on top of that, they can't eat cheese.
What?
Oh.
Just quit. Yeah. I'm gonna put them right over the edge.
And they can't drink wine.
Oh,
Nor
no.
can
My
they.
favorite.
And then, so like the big kicker too, no pickles.
I'm okay with that.
Seriously. Seriously. That was the one.
That was the one that got Nana.
I know the cheese would trip me up, but
You
then
know,
the
I know
pickles
up
just
here in
doesn't make
Cleveland, you
sense.
guys are really into pickles.
I like pickles.
It's so MAOI will typically break down something called tyramine, which is a naturally occurring substance that happens when you ferment food, like cheeses, some meats, pickled products, wine, things like that. So because you're screwing around with your MAOI, you're not going to be able to break that stuff down properly. Then you have these like massive increases in norepinephrine levels, and that can cause a massive increase in blood pressure. What happens when your blood pressure gets high? You can blow a gasket, right? And that's the technical term. So there you go. So like, here's the whole list of foods you can't eat.
Oh my
I know, right? Like, look at that.
Fuck that.
That's
Avocados?
bread and dairy.
That's
It's like
Right on.
70% of them.
You can't eat
I would never
any
take it.
soy sauce. How many of you love soy sauce? How many of you love
No more
soybean curd?
nachos.
Nachos is on there?
No, but I mean, you have guacamole.
Content of the nachos.
Yeah, cheese.
Age game.
What's what?
Any alcohol.
Like wild game meat. But if
Yeah.
it's been
Like aged.
So if you've allowed like I don't know, aged venison, if you've got some like any aged meat that's going to ferment, there's like a fermentation process for aging meat.
Wouldn't that be bad for anyone?
No.
Oh,
You
hell
can
no.
age
It's
meat.
very
Yes.
good.
Yeah, you can age meat.
What? How do you think we made it this far in life? They always ate old meat.
Real Housewives of Atlanta?
No.
Now, okay, like in the freezer?
No. There's a special process that you go through to age meat.
Yeah.
Does everybody know about
They
this?
didn't used to have refrigerators, and they couldn't eat the wild boar.
That's to
right?
preserve.
can
That's
you help
different
over
than
there?
aging.
I mean,
That's like the same thing. Aging.
Salt.
Yeah, they use salt.
Yeah.
Yeah, salt is
It's
a
the
jerky.
same.
It's preserved meat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does it taste better if it's old?
Oh no, Olivia does it.
Oh, so these MAOIs. What do these things do again?
Can we go?
No, we still have some time left.
When do they prescribe these?
They typically won't. They'll try not to, but folks will be on them for different reasons. The other problem is your other drugs that you take can be a problem as well, because MAOI will inhibit your liver enzymes, particularly your P450, which is a major drug. Tricyclic antidepressants, 3-ring structure, not a big deal. You guys know this. They do sort of inhibit reuptake of neurotransmitters. Here are some of the basic TCAs. Again, TCAs are not as commonly prescribed as SSRIs for depression, right? And a lot of that, again, is sort of your side effect profile. This is because TCAs also, not only do they affect your serotonin reuptake, but they also affect norepinephrine, right? So you're kind of working on both systems there. And again, jacking up those norepinephrine levels too high can really cause some problems, right? So there you go. Here are a number of drugs, some of which you may have heard of and some you may not have, right? But you can see sort of their effect on norepinephrine and serotonin. And if you go down here to these SSRIs, Prozac, Zoloft, and Paxil, I mean, these are pretty commonly prescribed drugs, right? I think you all probably have seen someone or know someone who's taken one of these. No effect on norepinephrine, very selective for serotonin, Paxil being a slight exception to that. And tweaking the norepinephrine just a little bit. But if you look at those TCAs, you see that a number of those have massive effects on norepinephrine and serotonin levels. So there you go. Also, you can block histamine receptors with TCAs, which is a problem because it gives you like major sedation and fatigue. And I loved the line in the book, for those of you, Jason, who read ahead. It said, this may be a problem for people who need to be alert. And I thought, I kind of assumed everyone needed to be alert. And I kind of thought, well, that's a problem for everybody. So TCAs do have, even though SSRIs will also have sort of sedation as a potential side effect, TCAs are a bit more powerful at that. However, if you are, you got a client who's agitated, hitting them with something that gives a little sedation might be a good idea, right? Kind of double whammy there. There are some anticholinergic effects, right, that you can have, like impaired memory, dizziness, things like that. You can have some cardiovascular effects as well, screwing around with the norepinephrine levels. If you overdose on these things, you can have some serious problems, including coma, right? Heart arrhythmias. You really have to take sort of like a 10 times dose to really cause a problem, like death. But you can still have other problems other ways. SSRIs, I mean, what don't you give somebody an SSRI for? I think is probably a better question than what do you give them an SSRI for, right? And they kind of prescribe an SSRI for everything. I would take a guess that 120% of your clients are on an SSRI. That's including the people on the wait list. So there's that, right? So SSRI. And for a variety of things, somebody say, well, I'm taking an SSRI because I have anxiety or I have depression or got a panic disorder or I'm OCD or you know, whatever. Let's give them an SSRI for just about anything. Basically, the idea here is it's going to increase serotonin, right? Because it's going to block that reuptake. Not a big deal. There are some side effects with blocking serotonin, right? You can actually cause anxiety. We talked about that last week. Blocking serotonin can cause anxiety, restlessness, muscle rigidity, nausea, headache, insomnia, sexual dysfunction. That's another one that'll pull you right out of depression. I don't know. Weight gain doesn't seem to be a problem though, as much.
There's a lot of people who won't take it because of the sexual dysfunction.
Yeah, and that's a reasonable concern, right? I mean, you don't have to answer this. How many of you have clients who come in because they have sexual dysfunction? I mean, that's a reasonable reason to see someone, right? You know, in a mental health situation, just because of sexual dysfunction. So you don't want to go in there and like take a medication for one thing and like cause another problem. I gotta get that fixed. So you kind of have to decide like which one's worse, right?
Yeah, one guy said I was really happy, but
Yeah.
couldn't get into it, so I was fine with that, not being happy anymore.
You know, trade-offs, right? I mean, you gotta decide.
Paraphrased because it was not that, but
Yeah, well, we sort of appreciate that, I guess. We're not on
you
that.
probably do.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, that's like another sort of ethical issue, right? You gotta think about, you know someone needs a medication to treat one problem, possibly create another problem, and may even for some people it does create a problem, right? It's not just a potential problem. You kind of have to figure out how you want to advise somebody to deal with that. Think about other things. Serotonin syndrome's a problem, right? If you take like 2 drugs that are screwing around with your serotonin levels, you can really cause some problems there. We talked about that before. There's some dual modulators, not a big deal. There are a lot of these what they call 3rd generation antidepressants, which include ketamine, right, and some other drugs. Ketamine's probably the only one that you really need to think about. We've talked about that. It works. It works like over 2/3 of the time, right? So, I mean, ketamine is that effective. There's really not, I mean, how often does an SSRI work?
50%.
Yeah, right? I mean, there are some people who just, take an SSRI. That's not gonna work. But ketamine almost always works. I mean, comparatively, right? So it's really, really effective.
So you said they use it like once and then that's effective for 3 months?
Can be for some folks. I mean, there's a lot of variability. Some folks it's a few days, some folks it's a few weeks. Some folks have seen up to 3 months on that. I wouldn't go in thinking that I'm going to get 3 months worth out of this shot of ketamine.
Have they modified it in any way so it doesn't have the other effects?
So they have looked at some other components, right? Some of the metabolites of ketamine that work on other systems, right? Some of their metabolites actually only activate AMPA receptors, right? And so that seems to be a mechanism of action that they want to exploit. Now, there's not really anything in that line yet, but folks are definitely working on that. Because if you screw around, if you block those AMPA receptors and then give folks ketamine, you don't seem to get better, right? So it seems like the AMPA receptor activity is what's important from that metabolite. So AMPA receptor agonists are definitely targets because those don't seem to cause those problems. They don't cause that anesthetic effect of ketamine. So I think as I was telling Jason earlier, I think that's going to be one of the better approaches, than just straight ketamine. What's a derivative of ketamine? What's a metabolite of ketamine? What's some other mechanism we can exploit that's in that ketamine pathway, and then we can actually, help folks out. So there you go. Also, when folks are sleep deprived, it enhances their AMPA synaptic plasticity. That's the home version of the game, right? That's the legal version if you guys don't want to take a chance on stealing ketamine from your veterinarian. I'm just trying to think of a reliable source of medical grade ketamine, right? Your veterinarian is one of those. Right? You guys know this. Don't worry too much about this stuff. There's this gallon and thing. You guys don't really need to think Hey, sometimes you don't even need to give people drugs, right? A great antidepressant is physical exercise. So you should just like grab people by the leg and start shaking their leg and give their an exercise. It works though. I mean, it works in animals too. If you have animals run, it seems to reverse the effects of stress hormones, right? So there you go. Just run your way out of depression. No, it's
Literally run away.
Run away from your problem.
run away from your problem. You tell people not to run away from their problems, but right here, scientific evidence that that's an effective strategy. Now, you do have to actually run. You can't just walk away quickly. You've actually got to break a sweat on this. You know. You can tell Dr. Beard I said they need to start a running clinic upstairs and not waste their time talking to you folks. Should just put treadmills in all the offices.
They rarely show up for
run while they
appointments.
talk.
Do you think they're gonna show up for some treadmill?
Surprise them. Strap them in. Shock them. They'll run. All right, we already talked about lithium. We talked about some of these other things. There are some other things you can give folks like anticonvulsants, right, if you want to treat mania. Part of the reason for that is, anticonvulsants are GABA agonists, right? So they're just going to like shut things down, right, and increase that inhibitory system, which might sound like a good idea if somebody's having a manic episode. Again, Kristen, we talked about this, especially valproic acid and its teratogenic effects with women. So if you think you're going to have a baby, you actually can have a baby, and you're doing things that might produce a baby, you might want to stay off the Depakote.
Do you have to get levels checked for that one as well?
No, not typically. I mean, not typically. The only reason you have to get your lithium levels checked is because of that toxicity issue with reabsorbing the lithium through your kidneys, right? If you're not getting that flushed out properly. All right. Questions, comments, concerns?